Thank you. Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and privilege to welcome our current, former, and future students, my academic staff, and our esteemed guests, Mr. Kathrada and Prof. Rod Alence. This webinar will discuss arguably one of the most topical issues in the world in decades, and that is the tariffs introduced by President of the US, Donald Trump. But I thought I should just spend a few seconds telling you about the school. Our mission as a school is to become Africa's leading school of governance. And we do this through our academic programs in areas such as governance, public policy, and development. We also offer executive courses and programs that give senior public servants, policymakers, and members of civil society who have an interest in being public servants. We give them the skills to enhance their capacity to strengthen the state. Our strengths include convening important dialogues, such as this one, with the view to creating an environment for dialogue to take place on topical issues affecting the globe. This webinar is a platform to discuss the Trump-created global economic crisis arising from the tariffs that is introduced. And these are already sweeping through the global landscape in ways that many of us thought was not going to be possible. It is my pleasure then to invite you to be part of this all-important conversation about the implications of Trump's tariffs on South Africa and the SADC region. I'm looking forward to the outcome of this conversation, as I'm unable to sit throughout, but I'm sure that our two guests and my academic Ike will facilitate the conversation to make sure that we all benefit from the conversation. Please remember to visit our website to check our academic programs, executive programs, and to participate in future dialogues, because we believe these are quite important to make sure that we all stay informed. I'm also looking forward to the outcome of this conversation, and it is my honor and pleasure to leave you in the capable hands of one of my most distinguished academic, Dr. Ekeminiabasi Eyita-Okon. We also know her as Iki or Mini, so you can choose to call her either Iki or Mini. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Mane and team for putting this conversation together so that we can all benefit from the information and the knowledge that our guests will be presenting this evening. So I hand over to you, Ekemini, to take the conversation forward, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Prof. And piggybacking on that, welcome everyone. And thank you for joining the first of our webinar series. We decided to take stock of the state of international relations and diplomacy today. And of course, the conversation on tariff is a very important one, not just for the African continent, but for South Africa and for SADC. And so I will start by introducing my guests who are here to engage on this topical and important issues with me. I have with me today, I have Prof. Rod Alence from the Wits International Relations, and here is his bio. So Prof. Alence is an Associate Professor in International Relations here at Wits University. He has also developed and coordinates an interdisciplinary postgraduate program in computational social sciences, also dubbed Masters in E-Science. His research focuses on the international and comparative political economy of development and democracy in Africa. He received an AB degree from Columbia University and an MA and PhD degrees from Stanford University. He has published widely, and an ongoing book project explores the impact of international trade volatility on economic growth trajectories in Africa since the early 20th century. And I'm also proud to say he was my graduate advisor. All right, next we've got Mr. Irshaad Kathrada. Thank you for being here. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Localisation Support Fund, a public benefit organization focused on developing industrial opportunities in South Africa. Previously, he served as the special advisor to the South African government minister responsible for trade and industry, and has nearly a decade of investment banking experience with JP Morgan in New York and London. He also founded a South African fintech company and led the finance function of the VC-backed climate tech company in the UK. He is a visiting research fellow at the Wits School of Governance, a senior associate at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and holds an MSc in Sustainability and Enterprise from the University of Oxford, as well as a Bachelor of Business Science from the University of Cape Town. Welcome, Prof. Alence and Irshaad Kathrada. All right, so let's get right into this conversation. So since the 20th of January, 2025, where the 45th and 47th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, became the president, we have seen through executive orders a shakeup of international order, from the mass deportation taking place in the US because of quote unquote issues of national security threats, to the mass pardoning of the January 5th Capitol attackers, and now to engaging in a trade war with countries in the world, but particularly with China, and the diplomatic spat that has been ongoing between South Africa and the United States. I think these are all big issues and big events, and it's important for us to take some time to unpack it. So I'll start with Prof. Alence. Now, when we look at these events that have been taking place, taking stock of Donald J. Trump's 45th presidency and now in the 47th presidency, we've seen scholars argue that we are now in a changing era of trade. We are no longer in an era characterized by multilateralism, but one that is characterized by unilateral protectionism. And so I wanted to invite you to help contextualize what the global trading system looks like. Are we really experiencing a shift from multilateralism to unilateralism, or are we simply just seeing a case of personality in leadership? Please help us make sense of Donald J. Trump's economic policy and the dynamics within a changing world order.
Thanks, Eki. One of the things that was left out of my bio was that I'm originally from the United States, although I've been in South Africa since 1994. So I don't speak on behalf of the Trump administration. I thought as an entry point into talking about these tariffs, I thought it would be useful to kind of go into the belly of the beast and just think about some of the basics of what a tariff is and what Trump thinks he's doing in the context of American politics first, and then look at some of the ramifications coming out from that. So, a kind of basic point to start with is that tariffs are the tool that Trump is promising will somehow make America great again economically, are nothing more than import taxes. So when someone who produces something outside of the US wants to sell it in the US, they'll now be required to pay a tax that domestic producers won't be required to pay. And although it's the importers who technically pay the tax, studies have shown that something like 95% of the cost of the tariffs will be passed on to consumers in the United States. And there's kind of a conventional analysis. If you think of a tariff, maybe just in a limited case of one good, you can think of who the immediate winners and losers would be from the imposition of a tariff. So on the winners' side, you would have the American producers who now find it a bit easier to compete against imported goods because those imported goods are going to be more expensive due to the tariff. That raises prices, means that they can do a bit better. Another immediate beneficiary could be the government in terms of tariff revenue, because they're now collecting this new tax on the goods that come into the country. Those two winners are partly mutually exclusive, because if you put the tariffs high enough that the goods don't come in, then you don't get any revenue, and vice versa. But those would be the main winners. And I think Trump has really built his argument in favor of tariffs around what it will do for domestic producers in the US who are his constituency as well as bringing in taxes, which I think he hopes will lessen the burden on sort of income taxes and other areas. Of course, the losers in all this, one set of losers would be the foreign producers who now are going to find it harder to compete with American producers in the domestic market. That would include South and Southern African producers. Um, and but kind of almost like the missing loser in this whole picture are the domestic consumers within the United States, who, when we look at the kind of basic model of a tariff, we're often talking about some kind of targeted tariff on a particular good. But basically what Trump has done is he's thrown tariffs over nearly all imports coming into the United States. And so this actually threatens to raise inflation in the US economy. And one of the things that Trump was promising people when he got elected was that, Biden was responsible for all this inflation. He was going to bring it down. Things are even the kind of negatives of tariffs are exaggerated given the fact that these are so sort of broad brush and very high levels of tariffs. So one thing we've seen already is that the benefits to American producers are going to be a lot less than you would think from a textbook description, because value chain production processes are so transnationalized now that basically what you end up doing is taxing the imported inputs that American producers need in order to produce. And there's already been stories about auto workers being laid off in Detroit, even within the past couple of weeks. And then I've already mentioned that because this is not just like a targeted tariff, it has implications for the entire price level for the US. So looking at inflation overall. Very early, we can see these really disruptive impacts of the tariffs, even though, in fact, the tariffs really haven't been in place yet. They've been announced, but goods that have come in under the tariffs probably are not even on the shelves yet. So we're not even seeing that level of impact. So we've seen these stock market declines. We've seen US Treasury bill yields going up, which means it's more expensive for the US government to borrow. And we've seen this threat of something that in the advanced industrialized countries hasn't been seen for decades, which is something called stagflation, which is that the tariffs have disrupted production, which threatens to bring you into a recession while at the same time raising prices. Usually, if you go into a recession, at least the bonus is that you don't have inflation, but here you're getting the two bads coming together at the same time. The IMF projections are that globally, these tariffs are probably going to lead to about a 0.5 percentage point cut in global economic growth. So that's average for the entire global economy. The estimates for South Africa are about the same, about a half a percent. So South Africa is not necessarily, any worse or better than average. Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, they're projecting about 0.3% because a lot of African countries don't really export much to the US, so they're a little bit less vulnerable. But one of the interesting things about the IMF projections is that the biggest loser of any country in the world is actually the United States, which is projected to lose about 1 full percentage point of economic growth as a result of these tariffs. So, I mean, my take on this is that Trump is promising things to his supporters, which just are not going to materialize. And we saw even yesterday, him having a bit of a second thoughts and pulling back on some of the tariffs. So, I mean, given the poor conceptualization of the whole program, and I mean, we go into more of the details on that. I think what we have here is a problem of credibility of these reforms, that I don't really think it's realistic to think that these tariffs are going to survive in their current form, say a year from now. I mean, how quickly they'll be abandoned is up in the air. But I mean, the congressional elections in the United States are next November. So not this coming November, but November 2026. Generally, the election season starts about 6 months before the congressional elections, and the Republicans have a very small majority at the moment. So if the tariffs even last until that election season, I think that most of them are going to, have a hard time surviving past that. And even though I don't think we'll necessarily go back to exactly what we saw before the tariffs, I think that these will tend to be pulled back over time. I don't see Trump really caring that much about what other countries say about the tariffs, except to the extent that the other countries are able to impose tariffs on his supporters within the United States. And I mean, the Canadians, the Europeans, the Chinese, they're not only retaliating to some of these tariffs, but they're trying to target the impact on the states where Trump supporters are located. So that would be kind of the broad context. And I think when we start looking at these issues of multilateralism versus kind of regional unilateral polarization, when we start looking at how individual firms should be dealing with this, I think we have to kind of take it with a bit of a grain of salt that these things are not permanent, that they're in place at the moment, that there will be changes to the way the U.S. engages with the world economy, but I think there's still a lot to come. Like I said, the Trump supporters in the U.S. have not even paid a dollar yet that they wouldn't have paid otherwise, because the goods that are subject to the tariffs haven't arrived yet in the country. So I think there's still a lot more that's going to happen over the coming months.
Definitely interesting view of the tit for tat strategy, the whole retaliatory approach to Trump's tariff, but also as of this morning, there has been conversations, especially by CEOs based in the US, on the need for Trump to pull back, because if this carries on, there's likely to be no goods on the shelves for consumers to purchase. So thank you for that reflection. Irshaad, I'd like to invite you to reflect on the ongoing trade wars, but particularly looking at the economic implications for South Africa. Are we seeing any huge impact in South Africa's trade and industry, in South Africa's local economy? Has investor confidence fallen over time as a result of the tariff? What are your reflections on the trade war vis-a-vis the local industry and local economy in South Africa and in Southern Africa?
Thanks, Eke. Thanks for the question. And before I get into the detail, I mean, as Rod said, we are still trying to understand what these tariffs mean, and so many of the effects that we think could occur have not yet flowed through the economic data. So in a sense, we're all taking our kind of first hot take at what these Trump tariffs mean for the world, for South Africa, for multilateralism and geopolitics as a whole. I mean, it's interesting. The world is waking up to what tariffs mean for themselves and better trying to understand. I mean, if you look at Google search data as an example, and I went on Google Trends, so if anyone's gone on that platform before, you can look up how often a word or a particular phrase or concept has been searched over the last 20 years of Google search data. Searches for trade war and tariffs is 10 times greater than it's ever been in the history of Google. So I think it just shows the kind of attention that this is garnering. So, congratulations to the Wits School of Governance for beginning these conversations, which are important to have now. If Trump does go through with the tariffs, and to Rod's point, we have absolutely no idea. Initially, they were asserted as a way of bringing back manufacturing to the United States, and as he says, at the same time, potentially also raising revenue. And as Rod puts it, these things are to some extent mutually exclusive in a way. You can't raise revenue and deter and sort of bring back manufacturing at the same time. It's a little bit one of the other. But the last time we saw tariffs go up in the world was around the time of the Great Depression. So that's just about 100 years ago, thereabouts. Coming out of the Second World War, we've been on a pathway of what's referred to as trade liberalization. Tariffs have been reducing, first with what was referred to as the agreements on tariffs and trade that was struck just after the Second World War, which was a recognition that in order to engender the kind of economic growth that we want to see, but also to create the kind of the linkages between different economic partners, we need to ensure that there's greater trade liberalization, greater integration of different economies. And that was a fundamental philosophy as to how we can prevent the world from entering into a conflict like we had 80 odd years ago. And so that was a fundamental philosophy that was established. At the same time that we established this concept of trade liberalization, we established this concept of development. And embedded within the very early agreements on trade was this concept of special and differential treatment. It's a term that I'm sure many people have heard, but effectively what it means is while we need to have reciprocity, and while we need to have every country treating other countries the same, and we all need to be moving towards lower tariffs, there's some recognition that tariffs play an important role in developing an industry, and that countries that are developing need to be provided with that industrial policy space in order to build their economies. And so countries like South Africa, like China, many countries across Africa, Latin America, and Asia have been given the space to keep their tariffs much higher for a longer period of time. And this has continued through much of that period. The trade liberalization pathway accelerated about 30 years ago with the establishment of the World Trade Organization. And since then, we've seen a massive drop. So in South Africa, for example, through much of the 1980s, South Africa had average tariffs of around about 30%. So any good coming into South Africa would be taxed 30%. And so it would make it sort of 30% more expensive than it otherwise would have been. By 1994, that had dropped to about 20%, and we're down to about 5%, 6%, depending on whether you weight it by trade in South Africa. And much of the world has followed the same regime. In a world where we do start to see increased moves to increase tariffs in the United States and other parts of the world, we're now reversing 80 years of global integration, which has been fundamentally important to the development of most developing economies. I mean, global trade has served as a huge engine of growth, and what's often been referred to as a pathway of convergence or catch-up growth for a large number of developing countries. The integration of companies that might sit in South Africa or Lesotho, in Egypt, in Cambodia, Bangladesh, into global value chains has allowed the growth of industries that have pulled people out of poverty, created revenue for those governments, allowed the investment in infrastructure, in health, in the provision of health services, of education, etc. The moment we begin to unwind that, we now cast a large uncertainty on the pathway for development and how global value chains will continue to serve as this engine of economic growth. So you asked me the question, what has been the impact on South Africa thus far? Much to Rod's point, I think we're still seeing what that means. But again, we've begun to see some of the market movements that we've seen in the United States. So in the same way that the US stock markets aggregated through the S&P 500 sold off, South African markets sold off as well. They've caught up some of those lost gains in the recent weeks, particularly with the suspension of tariffs for a 90-day period, but also some of the exemptions that have been provided, but also some of the sentiment that seems to be coming out of the United States that we might not have these tariffs in the same shape or form for the long term. But of course, I think it is going to shake the confidence of a lot of investors that are investing in particularly export-focused businesses, from the South African continent, from the African continent, from South Africa as well. I mean, South Africa exports about $15 billion worth of goods to the United States. Let's call it about 300 billion rand. It makes the United States one of our largest trade partners, second, I think, only to China. We have large trade partners in the EU, but it's a significantly important trade partner for us. And what are we exporting there? A lot of it is what's referred to as critical minerals. It's platinum, it's chromium, it's ferroalloys. Now, interestingly, the tariff regime that's been established in the United States has exempted a lot of those critical minerals from tariffs. So they ought to flow into the US. And there's good reason for that, because of course, a lot of those critical minerals are used in downstream industries and actually create jobs in the United States itself. And, when the South African government has gone out to the US to plead the case for various platforms that allow for preferential access for not only South Africa, but the rest of the continent. So that's the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA. A big thing that we've tried to say is that a lot of the exports from the African continent create jobs in the United States of America, allow goods to come in much cheaper that create downstream jobs, in addition to providing us the opportunities here. But there are some areas that will be subject to the tariffs, and there are a few areas that we are concerned about. We export a lot of cars to the United States. So South Africa, over the last 20 years, has really established itself as a global manufacturing hub for a number of automotive manufacturers. So Ford is here, Mercedes, BMW, VW, Isuzu, Toyota, a number of high-end marques. A lot of those cars are manufactured here and exported to 150 countries around the world, the United States being one of them. And has been a global strategy to position here and take advantage of the preferential access to the United States. We are at risk of losing a considerable amount of that production. So about $2 billion worth of exports go to the US in the automotive industry. Call that about 30 billion or about 40 billion rand. That's about 20% of our car exports, which is quite significant. And already it's an industry that is going through transition, that is trying to try to find its place in a world where we're moving from internal combustion engines that are driven by petroleum and diesel to ones that are going to be more electric. There were always questions about how the South African industry would navigate this transition. This complicates it. Absolutely. It absolutely complicates if these tariffs stay in place. There are other industries like our citrus industry that's grown off the back of large exports, and we export a lot of citrus fruit to parts of the United States. It works quite well because seasonally we're in the southern hemisphere, we're producing citrus when the United States isn't producing citrus, and so they've been very happy to allow our goods to flow in that industry. There are concerns about what we will do and what will happen. But I think the other thing I want to raise before I hand back to you, Eke, is we're worried about the direct exports to the United States, and we should be. But there's also a problem with potential what's referred to as trade displacement, because the United States represents a massive part of the global economy, about 25% of global GDP, or thereabouts. If the United States is going to be putting up, high barriers to trade, and if other countries like China are going to respond with their own trade barriers, what happens to that global trade that is effectively locked out of those markets? They inevitably have to find a market, and do they get dumped into the African economy, into South Africa? And so this is why you end up with a trade war, is because everyone fears that we're going to end up with this dumping coming in. So everyone starts pushing up their tariffs. And this is why, coming out of the Second World War, there was a decision and agreement taken that this is only going to lead to isolationism and conflict. We've got to create more regional integration. So yeah, more we can unpack, but let me hand back to you. I think you're on mute, okay?
Thank you very much for the insightful commentary, particularly about the nexus between the South African market and AGOA. And I think it was interesting. Earlier on, I was doing some research about looking at research that has tried to quantify what a loss or South Africa being exempted from AGOA would look like for South Africa's economy. And a study by Gracelyn points out that there will be a loss, but in relation to South Africa's GDP, it might not be substantial. She had used a computable general equilibrium model and predicts that it will be about 0.06% loss to South Africa. But also, when you look at the dynamic to AGOA, it's not just the South Africa problem. I mean, you talked about South Africa's automotive industry, and neighboring countries and countries in the African continent have been beneficiaries from getting leathers from Lesotho, to sourcing rubber in Cote d'Ivoire, in Nigeria, in Ghana. These are all, basically regionalizing value chains, and it has been beneficial to the African continent. And so, Prof, perhaps I should invite you, or maybe before I do that, just to encourage our audience, if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will have a dedicated session for questions and answer. I see that the chat is already buzzing. I promise I would read out your questions to my guests. But before I go into Q&A, perhaps I should invite you, Prof. Alence, just to first of all think about the dynamic of a South Africa without AGOA, because South Africa is up for renewal in this year, 2025. And there seems to be an anticipation that it may not make it into AGOA for two reasons. I mean, there's been debate around because now it has the upper middle class status. And so on that grounds, it doesn't qualify to be part of AGOA, but also on what the US has termed under the House Resolution 145 as differences in foreign policies. So what would a South Africa without AGOA look like? That's one. Secondly, how should South Africa comply with the US tariff while managing, one, its domestic economic dynamic, two, regional economic integration through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? What does that dynamic look like for a country like South Africa, Professor Alence?
Okay, thanks, Zeki. On sort of a broad strategic level, I mean, I think that all kind of third countries being drawn into this dispute really need to avoid taking the position that because the US is shooting themselves in the foot, we'll do the same as a way of getting back. Now, every individual country is going to have to deal with their bilateral economic relations with the US. But I do think that what's important is that we maintain the kind of rules-based multilateral system, even if we have to kind of bring down some giant parentheses around the US and just leave them there until, a lot of this uncertainty is sorted out. So I do think it's going to be important, to kind of maintain a sort of multilateral and rules-based approach. And as Irshaad said, it's not going to be easy for the rest of the world because it's not as if we want to divert automobile exports from the US to Europe. Europe's got their own issues at the same time. So there's not huge easy solutions to this, and I don't want this to be taken as a suggestion that there are. I think one thing that I wanted to note, though, is that intra-African trade is heavily concentrated in the manufacturing and food products sectors. And those are some of the products that are likely to be kind of pushed out if these tariffs stay in place. So there may be a kind of bit of a complementarity there, although we have to be realistic that the African market is much smaller and there are still a lot of infrastructure and trade facilitation problems that limit the ability to kind of expand intra-regional trade quite rapidly. But just for a sense of magnitude, I mean, South Africa exports 4 times more to Lesotho than they do to Brazil. So, some of these, sometimes we need to look closer to home to look for where some of the answers might be. As far as AGOA, clearly, as long as we're talking about 10-20% tariffs, I mean, AGOA is irrelevant because these are tariffs that would be on top of AGOA. So even if AGOA took tariffs to zero or close to zero, you're still adding these other tariffs on top. So the question is really kind of farther down the line, what is the kind of point that we return to? I do think, I mean, not only has AGOA as a whole been subject to, I think, 5 or 10-year reviews to where it wouldn't necessarily be increased. I think, as you mentioned, South Africa's status within AGOA has always been kind of had the weakest case to be in AGOA on sort of economic grounds, given the level of development of the country. So I think any South African producers who've been making use of AGOA have had to at least have in the back of their mind that this is not sort of access that they would have forever, and hopefully they will be able to find some ways of coping with higher tariffs. I'm hopeful that we won't be talking about 10-20% tariffs on these goods, that it may be closer to what Irshaad was saying, is more the norm, say, in manufacturing of maybe 3 or 4%. And so that's something to hope for. So I guess just the overall pitch would be, especially with South Africa, chairing the G20. I think the G20 will be a really useful forum to try to maintain sort of the global multilateral rule-based trading system independently of what the US is doing, so that at whatever stage the US becomes more integrated again, those things are still in place. What we don't want, as Irshaad said, was a return to the 1930s, where you basically end up with regional blocks fighting it out. There's right now, I mean, I guess you can say there's a trade war, but it's kind of like a one country trade war. So it's when the rest of the world starts fighting with each other that we would really have the problem, and hopefully a kind of multilateral and also a regional intra-African trade focus could help to at least minimize some of the disruption.
No, thank you very much for that, and for also raising the conversation on the upcoming G20. Perhaps I should also get Irshaad's perspective on this. I think you emphasized the fact that the tariffs actually exempt critical minerals, which is quite interesting. Do you think that that could be a leverage point for South Africa? Critical minerals are needed by the United States. And it's something that South Africa is blessed with, 80% platinum, rich in manganese. These are resources that it could leverage on as a bargaining tool to either reduce tariff or even engage in a tit for tat with South Africa. What are your perspectives on that? Is this something that South Africa can leverage, or do you think a more quote unquote quiet diplomacy, a softer approach to engage in Donald Trump that it has taken so far is the preference or should be the preference? I'll start with you, and then the Irshaad is here. Yes.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, the short answer is absolutely. It is something that South Africa could leverage and the rest of the African continent could leverage. The question is how. And this is the thing that we often struggle with in certainly debates in South Africa. And this is even at the political level, even happening within cabinet and the GNU right now. Everyone can agree on the outcome. No one can really agree on the how. And it's something that we grappled with quite a lot when we were inside, or when I was inside the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, looking at this challenge of beneficiation. We talk a lot about it in South Africa. We're blessed, as you say, with abundant natural resources, but the vast majority of that is being exported either in completely raw form or with very minimal processing. And the reason why that happens is because they are private enterprises that are in the most part responsible for mining these resources. And that is the way that we've decided to organize our society in South Africa around the lines of incentivizing private enterprises. But private enterprises will take their goods to the market that pays them the most. And so beneficiation only works if you can develop the domestic demand for those resources that will pay more than export markets. Now, because of the dislocation in global trade, there is an opportunity potentially to look at some of these critical minerals and to determine whether or not they could be potentially redirected into the South African market. One of the things we often struggle with, though, is critical minerals require downstream industries to give them their ultimate value. And a lot of that processing capacity doesn't sit on the African continent. It's to Rod's point. We export manufactured goods amongst each other. We export primary agriculture because we can consume those. But we don't export a lot of our raw mineral wealth to each other because, there isn't another market in Africa for South Africa's platinum. There's nowhere we can take it that someone can turn it into an industrial process. And the same for our aluminium, and the same for our other minerals, our chromium, which ultimately becomes stainless steel. That all ends up in China, the United States, in Germany, Japan. These are the economies that have made the investments in building out those downstream infrastructure. So if the market cannot do it, there are a couple of tools that South Africa could look to, and we've been a little bit reluctant to introduce those. So some countries around the world have introduced export taxes. So Indonesia is a good example, where on its nickel resources, and Indonesia is blessed with a majority of the world's nickel that can be used in battery applications. They've introduced export taxes. those export taxes disincentivize private companies from being able to export to the rest of the world. They've even gone so far as to institute full-on export bans on some of those minerals as well. South Africa's been reluctant to do so for all sorts of reasons, but I think if we continue to walk down this path where the global trade order is being effectively rethought, relooked at, reconsidered, there is an opportunity for us to look at some of these tools and how we do them. But you know that it comes with considerable balancing that needs to be done. And I think that is the hard thing for South African policymakers to go through, for African policymakers to go through. I mean, one of the things we've talked about, and I see some of the questions are touching on the African continental free trade area and whether or not this is an opportunity. And of course it is, because Africa is trying to liberalize trade within itself. I mean, just piggybacking on the point which Rod has made, talking about intra-African trade, notwithstanding the fact that it's skewed towards manufacturing and agriculture, Africa doesn't actually trade that much with each other. So, you know, for every 1 rand of trade which is done in the African continent, only 13 cents, 13% of that comes from other African countries. To put that in context, in the EU, which is, you know, the gold standard, it's about 75%. But even the next worst, which is Latin America, is close to 50%. Africa lags the rest of the world in terms of its intra-regional trade. And so there's an opportunity to stitch the continent together in a much more cohesive way. You know, the trade liberalization pathway that the AfCFTA has set us on is only one part of it. And it doesn't mean just because we're lowering tariffs now between ourselves and Egypt that we're going to suddenly trade more with each other. The question is, logistically, is it easy to get goods from the top of the African continent to the south, or even from the middle? I mean, we've talked a lot about the opportunities to export steel from South Africa. South Africa is still, you know, after Egypt, the second largest steel manufacturing economy on the continent. But we don't export a lot of it to the Congo or to Zambia or other parts of the continent, in part because it's still easier to get Chinese steel to the DRC than it is to get South African steel. And part of that is a logistics problem. The problem that to get steel from South Africa to the DRC, there's no rail network. You're having to take that steel on a truck over very questionable roads with lots of potholes and difficulties crossing borders and all the rest of it. So the opportunity is absolutely there. And we do need to be thinking very strategically about this. But there are a lot of challenges and problems that need to be solved in bringing this African project together, or in being able to leverage the benefits out of our critical minerals a lot more cohesively.
Thank you very much for that. I guess that also foregrounds the role of political governance, the ability to follow through on commitment. If I remember correctly, I think one of the plans, the continental plan, was to have an intra-continental railway network to allow for the ease of movement of goods from one part of the continent to the other. We're still waiting for that railway. Right, I will now take questions. I'll read the questions in the comment, and please, if there are hands, feel free to raise your hand. I'll start with Shandini Naidu. Thank you for your question. She says, thank you for hosting this important discussion. I am a board member at the SOE based in South Africa in the agri sector and run a private entity in export of agri-goods. My question to the panel is, what are the implications with the threat of sanctions and exit of South Africa from the AGOA Act? And the follow-up question to that is, how can we as participants in the export trade in agriculture work around this issue? Do you want to take the question first and then we move on to the next? There are quite a few questions in the chat.
Your call, Eke, if you want to take one.
I think there was another one on agriculture somewhere. Maybe we can take those together.
Okay. So those were the two on agriculture. The rest are about fallout. So that was Shandini's Naidu. So perhaps let's take that and then we move on to the other questions in the chat. Prof. Alence and then Irshaad.
Thanks. I think Irshaad's probably better equipped on this one, having had more attention to the South African kind of involvement in some of these value chains. My two general The first point goes back to my kind of opening comments, which is that um, don't immediately assume that whatever the policy is today will be the policy tomorrow or next week or in a couple of months. So I really think these tariffs can have very disruptive short-term effects for a lot of firms. And my general sense is that if you're in that category, you would want to really try to muddle through the best you can and wait for the dust to settle a bit. Obviously, there would be incentives as well to try to diversify your markets as much as possible. There's limits to how much that can be done. But what I would hate to see is, and I mean, it probably wouldn't happen with an SOE, but what I would hate to see is just firms going under because they fear that there's going to be 30% tariffs on South Africa forever from the US, and therefore that market is not available. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about where this is going to go. And like I said, if you could tread water for a few months, hopefully it'll be a little bit clearer what the options are.
All right, thank you. Prof's message is hold on to your beer. All right, Irshaad.
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and maybe one thing to say, and I think Rod has sort of alluded to this is, I mean, what's going to happen over these 90 days? We have absolutely no idea. I mean, the one thing that's absolutely clear is that Trump fancies himself a deal maker, and so uh, one argument that has been raised as to why he applied this broad brush tariff policy, which honestly defies all economic sense. It defies it from a fundamental perspective, but also in the way that the tariffs were actually determined. And I'm sure it's now become fairly widely understood the kind of formula that Trump had applied in order to determine what tariffs ought to be applied to South Africa or Lesotho for that matter. But effectively, it just looked at the trade deficit. And if you exported more to the United States than you imported, and therefore the US had a much bigger trade deficit with you, that in effect drove the size of the tariff. Now, there's been some allegation that he actually got that out of ChatGPT, and whether that's true or not, I think that's a kind of a fascinating little anecdote. But I think what it's forced everyone to do is to come to the table. And quite honestly, I do think that that's what certainly Trump and perhaps his colleagues would want. And so there is likely to be a lot of negotiation, and we don't yet know what's the golden prize that he wants from South Africa, for example. Is it greater access to our critical minerals? Is it specific deals? Is it land deals? I mean, we're seeing that in the way that he's engaging with the Ukraine and in respect of Russia. There's an attempt to grab onto minerals that were not part of the deal initially. And so we might see this play out. I mean, to the actual specific question about what to do in agriculture, look, the US is a big market for South African produce, but it's of course not the only market for South African produce. The South African government has been doing quite a bit of work to open up agricultural markets around the world. Now, agriculture is a very tricky good, as Shandini will no doubt know. But in effect, it's not just tariffs. There are not a large number of non-tariff barriers, particularly sanitary and phytosanitary standards that get applied in different markets. So effectively, that's health standards. So often, for example, South Africa has a dispute with Europe at the moment, which it hasn't yet taken to the WTO. At least it's in the beginnings of bringing a case. But effectively, Europe has banned the export of South African citrus into the EU, and are alleging that there is a particular microbial little bug called citrus black spot that exists on the oranges, sorry. And notwithstanding all the scientific evidence that we've brought to suggest that that doesn't exist and that it can't be transferred, they've still instituted this ban. So I raise that just as an example of saying, look, there is work that's happening, and over the last 5 years, we were able to improve our beef access to the UAE and Saudi and other parts of the Middle East. We opened up markets for rooibos tea in China. We did similar market access in Thailand and in Japan. And so if you are an exporter, one thing that I do is I spend a huge amount of time looking at the data. And I love the trade data. I love it in particular because one, it's free. And so there are a lot of great resources that are out there, Trade Map and all the rest of it. The World Bank, has some fantastic trade data, but it allows you to go into fairly specific detail as to which products are flowing across borders. And that gives us a good sense of which countries are demanding which products. And we can also then have a look at to what extent does South Africa already enjoy good market access or not. Where we don't, the question is, what is it that's impeding us? Is it logistics? And sometimes it is logistics. One of the big things that we've had to solve in terms of getting market access to the Middle East has not been the tariff barriers, but the fact that there just aren't a lot of ships going between South Africa and the Middle East. In fact, one of the big automotive manufacturers approached government a couple of years ago and said, we'd be prepared to invest massively if you can ensure that we have much more what they call roll-on, roll-off ships, the kind of ships that you can drive a car on and drive off. If you can ensure that we can get more of those to the Middle East, we'll make the investment. The problem is the South African government doesn't control those shipping routes. Those are, large multinational shipping companies like AP Møller Maersk and the like that control those. And so there's a delicate negotiation to ensure that we can get more shipping access. So I think it's about first understanding where the markets are and then going through the very detailed work of what are the impediments. Is it logistics? Is it, sanitary standards? Are there tariff barriers? Are there other, licensings and supports that you need? Because often it's the Department of Agriculture that's responsible for ensuring the implementation of various what they call residue control agreements. Basically, that's ensuring that we haven't used pesticides and anything like that. And so, in my day job, we're doing a little bit of work with the Department of Agriculture and some of the standards bodies to ensure that they are well capacitated so that South Africa can export dairy and other food composite products to the EU and other markets. So yeah, let me pause there. Okay, hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You said in your day job, is there a night one?
This is my night job, clearly, the sun setting.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. and Irshaad. More questions, both on myself and in the comments. So I'll just read through a few and then we can give you opportunity to respond. So Soraya Mohideen says, what does this mean for the rules-based system, especially for developing countries? Zimkita is asking, how can South Africa and its regional partners strategically navigate these barriers, and what measures can be taken to mitigate the economic fallout while strengthening ties with other global trade partners like the EU or China? Ayabulela is saying, African nations are creating a common market with 55 economies combined. Is it not an opportunity to elevate intra-Africa movement of goods, services, and money? That has always been a collective African goal since we have a vast yet untapped market by us Africans. Langa is saying, we have always agreed that the lowering of tariffs that came with our South Africa being our joining the WTO in 95 led to massive deindustrialization. One could argue that the tariff moment and the return to industrial policy is key economies such as the US and EU offers an opportunity for reindustrialization without the usual limitations of the multilateral trade rules. Any comment from Irshaad? There's another one by Jonathan Nkado. What can happen if other countries follow suit and raise tariffs like China? So I can see there's a tit for tat strategist here in our midst. Leah is asking, why does South Africa behave as though it will diminish our GDP when we can establish ties with SADC or BRICS to create an alternative for AGOA that will strengthen our imports? I'll stop there. Maybe this time I would invite Prof. Alence to respond first, and then we go to Irshaad.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of different issues in there. I mean, I think you might not guess it by watching the international business news since Trump started with these tariffs, but we actually have a global system, a global multilateral system that creates a lot of market access throughout the world. And even China's retaliation against the US was done in terms of the rules of the WTO. So I don't think you might get the impression, only looking at the behavior of the US over the past few weeks, that that system is gone, but that system is still there. And I think as things start to filter through this, I mean, we're seeing this only domestically starting to happen within the US, that some of the things that the Trump administration has done of dubious legality is now being challenged in the courts and overturned. I think we'll see some degree of that happening internationally through the WTO. However, the Trump administration replies to that. But again, I think the practical challenge is that there's all these laudable, diversification of trade patterns, greater intra-African trade, greater South-South trade. They're all good things, and they're all things that the current events kind of should draw our attention to, maybe putting more effort into building them, but they're not things that happen easily overnight. So, that is a challenge. I'm a big supporter and optimist about, in the long term, about intra-African trade. I'm maybe controversially not a big fan of the AFCFTA, in the sense that I think it hasn't really addressed some of, as was raised earlier, these things like transport infrastructure and trade facilitation at the borders. There's not great enforcement when governments don't comply with their commitments under the agreement. And sometimes I think that the AFCFTA is kind of up there as a sort of symbol of an aspiration, which is a good aspiration, but I'm not convinced that it provides a really practical, sort of meaningful contribution to trade. I think the contributions are going to come at a much lower level, dealing with a lot of these border and infrastructure issues in the coming years. And again, I mean, you're not going to build a 3-lane highway to the Congo in 90 days. So, there are constraints on some of these things, but yeah, but again, it's a challenge. I think people are going, hopefully, to put some energy into recognizing the vulnerability to a kind of action like this by the United States. And just like with COVID, we realized that it's maybe not the greatest idea to have this just-in-time, production processes that rely on ports and everything else working seamlessly, and things coming in at the right time. And that made people think a little bit more about, well, what kind of ways do we have of hedging against that sort of a risk? I don't think that the Trump tariffs in their current form are going to be permanent, but I think it's raised a certain kind of risk that I think anyone who's involved in international trade and investment now has to think, really, should we be doing things a bit differently from the ways that we've done them before?
Thank you very much, Prof. Irshaad?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot to pick up on. If I can start just with picking up on one of the points Rod made, and as he said, not as big a fan of the AFCFTA. It's interesting. It's an interesting point. I mean, what is the AFCFTA? It is aspiration. I think we have to recognize it for what it is. It's aspirational. All ultimate goals and endeavors must start with an aspiration. I think that perhaps it's been poorly understood and maybe poorly communicated, certainly in broader society. I think we've communicated the AFCFTA perhaps even within, parliament to parliamentarians, that it's this great thing that's going to fix everything. And there have been, some studies by I think it was the World Economic Forum had done some work on trying to understand what the economic dividend could be from implementation of the AFCFTA, and obviously all economic modeling, all models are mostly wrong, but some of them are useful, right? Is the adage. And I think what we can see is that greater integration of the African continent is a good thing, and I think that, we do need to be weaning ourselves off exports to any given one market, be it being it the United States or other. I think we've had a very interesting period. I think, if I reflect on my opening statements around this era of development that we've been in for the last 80 years, if we cast that within the history of humanity, if we take the kind of the full 10,000 years of what we consider sort of civilization, this era of development is relatively new. We've only been doing it for less than a percentage point of time, the last 80 years. And so there's a lot to learn from it. Initially, a lot of countries tried to tie their economies to large developed countries. That started off kind of replicating the colonial ties. And so when you look at the markets that have greatest access to Africa, they tend to still be the colonial powers. France exports a lot to French West Africa. Britain has closer ties with its former colonies. The only countries that have really broken that are China and the United States. And you could argue that the United States implemented a form of neocolonialism in the post-war period. So I think it is forcing us to look a little bit differently. And a lot of developing countries have now developed the wealth that could potentially, create dividends across borders to other developing countries. And so I think, I think we are at a very interesting point where we've got to be thinking a lot more critically about how do we make this work beyond the aspirations. I mean, I think the answer to all of the questions around is this an opportunity and can we do this? Yes, it is an opportunity. I mean, the African continent is an opportunity. Tying ourselves much more closely to other developing countries or even to our immediate SADC neighbors is a great opportunity. I think we've got to find the will, both political and across society, to kind of to make it work. A lot of work, a lot of thinking is going into the development of what I refer to as regional value chain. So that is to the point you raised, Eke. It's taking leather from Namibia and using it in our automotive industry here in South Africa, or other raw materials. But again, it requires the investment. And part of what the IDC has been doing across the African continent, a lot of people don't actually know this, but the Industrial Development Corporation, which is South Africa's DFI, which does a lot of development work in South Africa, was responsible for the development of Sasol, more than 50 years ago. A lot of, they have increasingly been investing in projects across the African continent as a way of creating a demand for South African goods, so that ultimately you create this regional value chain where some of our goods can go across the continent. DBSA is doing similarly. The AFDB, the African Development Bank, is trying to do some similar work. So I think these are very important things. I think there is an opportunity in this dislocation of global trade, or this upending of the rules-based system that we've all known and loved for the last 30 odd years, is that we do need to think very, very differently about the way that we embark on development. I don't think that's going to be easy, because if we are going into a tit for tat environment, we may be penalized for our attempts to create regional integration. I mean, if you just listen to the way that Trump has talked about the EU, he's talked about it effectively as an attempt to, in his words, screw the United States. And the EU was an attempt to create a regional platform for integration. And yes, it's trying to, offset the overwhelming power that the United States has in the global economy. He may think similarly about BRICS, and he may feel similarly about the AFCFTA. And so I think one of the reasons why I think AGOA will probably go is that it reduces the opportunity for a divide and conquer approach, which I imagine this administration may want to take, where you rather try to engage bilaterally with Kenya, as opposed to kind of having the entire market come together.
Definitely, thank you for that. Still a lot of questions, but I see that Siposetu Mahele has the hand up. Siposetu, the floor is yours. Could you kindly unmute Siposetu, please? Sibusetu, can you try unmuting yourself? I see you've been permitted to speak. Just try unmuting yourself on your device. Okay, while we're sorting that out. While we're sorting that out, there's still a few questions and comments here in the chat. Zimkite is saying, considering the recent call between Trump and Ramaphosa and the sudden shift in tone, could this indicate that the US is reconsidering its tariff strategy with South Africa and the region? And if so, what factors are influencing this reconsideration? Ntombizonke says, it's very disappointing to hear that there's little to none intercontinental trade. What needs to be done to work around this? Karen Abraham says, can we even have this conversation without also including a discussion of the gross consumerism of the US and the sheer buying power that may affect future and alternative markets? Zamangwane says, great discussion, particularly interested in the export tax idea for South Africa. Thanks to the panelist. Temba says, China's President Xi Jinping has asked other countries worldwide to fight back against the tariff from the USA and to avoid being bullied by the USA. Should African leaders heed that advice? Good question. Lucinda says, I agree. I call it after I see that both panelists have been afraid to use the word, is aspirational. We may not see the full promise of it in our lifetime. It's a bold vision, but we must start thinking seriously about trading within the continent. We need to plant the seeds now. Lucinda, I would like to see it in my lifetime. How old do you think I am? Langa says, we all agree that multilateral trading system has been undermined by the US since Biden and the proliferation of regional trade agreements and plurilaterals. China has undermined the WTO since joining the system by maintaining a state-driven capitalist system characterized by massive subsidies. The multilateral trading system is comatose at the moment. Everyone from Brussels, London, Washington, Pretoria, etc. If the system is alive, as Prof. Rod argues, why are countries barred the symbolic gesture by China not responding through the system? So those are the questions in the chat. Siposetu, are you with us? Siposetu Machele, can you hear me? Okay, while we wait for, and anytime your mic is sorted, please feel free to jump in, Siposetu. But in the meantime, may I get your reflection on those comments and questions around after being a promise that we may not see in our lifetime. I don't know how old Lucinda thinks we are. The effectiveness of the multilateral trading system and that Prof. Rod has mentioned, and why are other countries not fighting through the system? Question about should African leaders heed to China's advice on retaliation? And Irshaad, you've been asked to expand on your idea of export tax. And Karen has pointed out the issue of gross consumerism in the US and a question around what do we need to do to encourage more intracontinental trade. So Irshaad, I'll invite you first and then I'll move to Prof. Alence.
Sure. And look, I think that covers quite a lot. So maybe if we start off by saying, because there were also questions around should South Africa also impose its own tariffs or increase tariffs. Look, we do in South Africa. We have an approach which is very different to the United States. So, you touched on it, Eke, at the beginning, effectively with the, just wielding a pen through executive orders, the US president is able to impose greater tariffs in the United States. In fact, President Ramaphosa doesn't have that power in South Africa. He doesn't have the same level of executive authority. And so there's a process which has been established in legislation here in South Africa through both the International Trade Administration Act as well as the Customs and Excise Act, where the International Trade Administration Commission is responsible for investigating, making a recommendation to the Minister of Trade and Industry, who then makes the same recommendation onto the Minister of Finance before they instruct SARS to implement. So you have four sort of checks and balances along the way. Could we introduce tariffs? Of course we could, but the one thing I'd be very worried about is the inflationary effect. And the one thing we saw through a lot of our work in trade and industry is that tariffs alone are not enough to cultivate a manufacturing environment within South Africa. In fact, tariffs is just one of a number of industrial policy tools at your disposal. You've got tariffs, you've got industrial funding, you've got changes to the tax regime, you've got competition policy. In South Africa, we've got Black economic empowerment policy. All of these are very different tools of industrial development, which we use at our disposal. Just introducing tariffs in and of itself may not necessarily create the kind of environment that we want in South Africa, may not create the jobs, certainly not in the short term. In fact, most often what happens is that unless you've got existing manufacturing capacity, you're going to get a short-term spike in prices. And only over time with investment and uncertainty will you begin to have these the kind of investment that you need. And I think, one of the challenges that I think a lot of investors in the United States are going to find is with all of this uncertainty, you don't know from one day to the next whether the tariffs will still be in place. So should you start investing today in manufacturing capacity in any line? We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen at the end of 90 days. And even at the end of 90 days, we have no idea from one day to the next. The regime that we've established in South Africa has been designed to create a sense of stability, that we're not just changing tariffs all the time. Yes, we're trying to be agile and respond to the needs of society. And we see often the South African government introduce what's referred to as safeguards or anti-dumping duties. These are very short-term measures which are used to address any short-term dislocations in trade or attempts by other countries to push product onto our market. And I think that works quite well. Could we be more responsive? Of course, there's always room for opportunity for improvement, but I think we need to be strategic about these things. Obviously, if we're now going into a world where everyone is raising their tariffs, South Africa may be forced to do the same, and we may be forced to do the same outside of the rules-based system. And by the way, the rules-based system has been under threat for a number of years now. I mean, we don't have a functioning appellate body at the WTO, which means that even if there was a harm that was created, there isn't really the structures and functions through which to take anything through. And I think this has been one of the big challenges that a lot of people have had, including South Africa, with the functioning of the WTO. So there was a question, wanting me to touch on export taxes. Yeah, I mean, look, so what kind of export taxes do we have in South Africa? We have a small export tax on I think polished diamonds, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have a quasi-export tax on scrap metal. And that is and I say quasi because it's done under a different instrument, but effectively what it's trying to do is to disincentivize exports so that you'll supply more of that material into the domestic market for downstream processing. The export tax on scrap metal has not been without its controversy, and of course there are always winners and losers. And some have argued that in part it's contributed to the downfall of UMSA. That's not necessarily a view which I hold, but I can certainly see where it does begin to challenge the system. And so I think we need to think very carefully about the use of export taxes in South Africa and where there are opportunities to do it. I mean, there've been debates about whether we ought to have an export tax on chromium. South Africa has 70% of the world's chromium reserves, and a big use of chromium is in stainless steel. So all the knives and forks and cutlery that we use on a day-to-day basis, that's made with ultimately from a source of chromium. Very little of that stainless steel is actually produced in South Africa. We've got one major manufacturer. They're exporting quite a lot to the EU, but we're importing a lot of our cutlery from China and elsewhere. And so there's been a big argument to try and introduce a chromium ore tax. But again, it's been reasonably unpopular to date. But I think we're in a space where we really do need to be looking critically at these things and whether we can introduce any of them to the benefit of South Africa. Okay, you'll steer me. I mean, there've been lots of questions. I've probably only touched on a handful of them. You'll steer us where you want us to go.
Yeah, no problem. I think Rod will come in now and talk about the Langa's question on the multilateral trading system and why everyone, I think you already answered that. At the moment, we don't have an appellate body to help manage the dispute in the WTO. So everything's at a standstill with the institution at the moment. But there was a question around China advising the other countries in the world to fight back using tariffs. Do you think we need to reciprocate? Should Africa engage in tit for tat? And also, do we even have the capacity to engage in the tit for tat?
Yeah, thanks, Eki. I think a few of those questions are kind of related. I think it's important to bring in a little bit of international relations jargon at this point and to distinguish between multilateral organizations and supranational organizations. What we clearly don't have is kind of a supranational global trade police force that can throw countries in jail when they break the rules. So what has to happen through the WTO is governments need to lodge grievances and they can there are certain forms of retaliation that are considered acceptable under WTO rules. I think the reason why we haven't seen a lot of countries doing this, I mean, China actually did it quite quietly. I mean, there was not a lot of grandstanding. Xi Jinping has been very quiet about but firm in his stance on this. But I think that what is going on is there's just so much uncertainty. I mean, even the EU has very little idea what Trump wants from them. And while there's that uncertainty, governments and regional bodies like the EU are kind of gauging, is it in our interest to, retaliate, or should we just wait and let things calm down until we understand a little bit better what's going on? So I don't think it's that the world has been completely cowed by Trump, the fact that there hasn't been this sort of unanimous retaliation. I think countries are thinking about what they can do. To go back to my introductory remarks, I mean, I think it's much better if they think about how they're going to do that, at least within the context of a global sort of rules-based system, as opposed to everybody taking, their own nationalist stance and then undermining the system even further. Okay, just a couple other points. One is that Trump actually doesn't have the tariff power necessarily that he's been using. I mean, the US Constitution actually specifically allocates authority over tariffs to Congress, to the legislature. And over time, there's been some modification of that under emergency situations where it could be in the interest to have the president be able to move quickly within a limited time frame. Now, Trump has claimed a global trade emergency, or he hasn't even declared it, he's just kind of asserted it informally as a basis for proceeding with all these tariffs. And it's really up to Congress to stop him. And the Republicans have narrow majorities in both houses. So far, they haven't been willing to do that. But there's been starting to be some noises from a handful of Republicans in Congress whose constituencies are really at risk of bad economic dislocation from these tariffs, where they might basically try to clamp down on this idea of an emergency, which would mean that either there'd be a very short time limit on the president's ability to do tariffs without Congress approving them, or that they couldn't do it at all without it going through Congress. So, I mean, I don't think we're at the point of that happening, but there's are issues there. And in terms of the uncertainty about Trump, I mean, a good example of this is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. During his first administration, he came out and said that NAFTA was the worst free trade agreement in the history of history, and all his usual bombast. So he came up with something new called the UMCA, which was actually a slightly modified version of NAFTA, and claimed victory that he had somehow, fundamentally reformed this horrible treaty that some other president had dared to negotiate. The tariffs on Canada and Mexico that were the first ones he imposed actually run counter to his own trade agreement that he made with Canada and Mexico. So all this feeds into this uncertainty of different governments not really knowing what Trump is up to, and therefore being, I think a lot of them are just sort of taking a wait and see attitude, which won't last forever. But I think it's why we haven't seen a huge concerted resistance to this. The final point is an interesting point about consumption and mass consumption in US society. I think it's a hard one to answer, but I think what's very interesting about if these tariffs actually go through, even if it's for only a couple months, is I don't think many American consumers are very aware of the extent to which their consumption depends on these global economic systems of investment and trade. So when, for example, I mean, if Chinese goods are just off the shelves for a month, I think you will see a lot of light bulbs starting to go off in Americans' heads. I mean, there were estimates that if you had to make an iPhone in America alone, it would cost like 3 or 4 times as much as it costs now. Now, it's fine to say "Make America Great Again." We need to bring these production processes here, but how many consumers are really willing to pay 3 times as much for a phone as they were before? So these questions will hopefully be a little bit clearer to Americans who tend to have a lack of awareness of their role, that they're not just an island, that they're actually part of this highly integrated global economy.
Thank you very much, Prof. Siposetu, I have noted your comment on the challenges with the PC and the fact that your question has been addressed. So thank you for that. I see Ayabulela responded to Lusanda in terms of a question around how we work around the deficits in the African continent. Mashi Nkadimeng is asking, to what extent is South Africa or Valley reliant on the US market, and what policy measures could South Africa and or SACU policymakers implement to soften the blow on US tariffs and reduce this dependence in the future? And piggybacking off that, basically leading to my question, how should South Africa recalibrate, especially when it comes to its economic security, but how it uses economic diplomacy and trade strategies to, first of all, preemptively mitigate risks? So to prevent this cycle from happening again, if we have another Trump in the next election cycle, how does South Africa ensure that it protects itself? How should Southern Africa ensure that it protects itself? But of course, with implications for the African continent, mitigating this risk and also capitalizing on other opportunities within the global South. I would invite Irshaad to respond first, and then Professor Alence.
So one thing we're seeing quite a lot, and I see this through the work that I do with the Localization Support Fund, is companies themselves are very concerned about supply chain resilience. As Rod mentioned, coming out of the COVID period, where we had created global supply chains in such a way where we were offshoring so much. And I mean, I'll give you an example, an anecdote from the South African clothing industry. For a long time, the model was to look at what was happening in Europe or the Northern Hemisphere from a fashion perspective, and to assume that 6 months later that fashion trend would be replicated in South Africa, and to place your orders, have it made in China, and 3 months later you have it on the shelves. And that model has broken down for two reasons. The first one is actually South Africans have developed their own sense of fashion, which is now becoming unique and distinct from Northern Europe, from European and Northern Hemisphere trends. And so there needs to be a greater response to customer demands. And so that means for a lot of retailers, they need to bring a lot more of their manufacturing capacity closer to their customer because they need to ensure that they're not just placing orders, having lots of inventory on their shelves, which doesn't sell ultimately. And so this is leading to what's referred to as a quick response model. Now, quick response models don't necessarily work when you're having to rely on global supply chains and clothing coming out of China. This leads me to the second phenomenon, which is happening, is that coming out of COVID, supply chains have lengthened. So what might have taken you about 4 or 5 months to get through global supply chains, including the ports, is now taking you 8, 9, even 12 months sometimes. And so as a result, retailers are very incentivized to localize their manufacturing capacity in South Africa. Now, that's an amazing commercial and business opportunity that from a developmental point, our organization as the Localization Support Fund is trying to manage and chase. And so the work that we're doing is, we spending quite a bit of time with the retailers, understanding the product categories that they most want to sell. Where do they see South African fashion going? What are the price points that South African consumers care about? And then how can we share that information in a way with the manufacturing universe of South Africa so that the capacity is much more aligned to the product categories that retailers are expecting to see going off the shelves. So this is a way in which the dislocation in global supply chains, which predated Trump, which I think will only be exacerbated by what's happening now, is leading to opportunities in South Africa. Supply chain resilience is a big thing. And this is where, as I say, there is a commercial rationale. And the one thing I've learned through my career, including my time in government, is as much as you may have a developmental rationale for doing something, if it doesn't line adequately with the commercial realities or the commercial incentives for doing it, then you have capital and politics at odds with each other. And when capital and politics are at odds with each other, you end up with fights in society. And I think parts of the problems we've had in South Africa and many developing countries, it's not a uniquely South African thing, is that capital and politics are often at odds. There is an opportunity now through these dislocations where we can find alignments between capital and politics, and I think that's an important thing, and it's happening through so many of the conversations we have. I mean, I touched on the clothing industry. We're seeing a similar phenomenon in the food and beverage industry with the machinery that is on a plant floor, the actual equipment that does the packaging and the sorting that you've no doubt seen videos and pictures of. That's all currently imported. But the problem is when there's a shutdown on a line, we're having to wait weeks and weeks and weeks for that manufacturing capacity to come back. So even those German, Japanese, and US manufacturers that are exporting into the US market are now increasingly incentivized to set up some manufacturing capacity here, at least focused on the high value, high volume goods which are flowing through. And so we're trying to leverage those incentives, those commercial incentives to drive resilience and localization. I mean, there are clearly policy opportunities, but I think what we need to do is try and find those areas where they can be nudged and aligned with the commercial opportunities as well.
Thank you very much, Irshaad. Prof. Alence.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Irshaad's given some great, concrete examples to illustrate some of these dilemmas that firms and countries are going to be facing going forward. I think the only thing that I would add to that is that, there's always going to be sort of a risk-reward trade-off with a lot of these decisions. So I think that what has clearly happened is, for many decades, whatever you thought of US foreign economic policy, there was sort of like a range of what could reasonably happen that everyone kind of thought they understood and was able to kind of think through their interests within that realm. What Trump has done is he's just destroyed that. So he's just smashed that, and that's something completely out of the range of what anyone would have expected could be done. Now, what happens as a result? Well, that means that there's now a new risk that people didn't think about before, that, maybe Trump does this temporarily, but maybe someone else like Trump wins the election after that or the one after that, and then you face a similar kind of thing. And so this needs to be kind of factored in a way that it wasn't before. I think that, I mean, the US is still, depending on how you measure it, but probably the biggest consumer market in the world. And so it's if you go completely anti-risk and say, I'm just not going to touch the US again, you're going to give up a lot of reward. So it's a balancing question, but I just feel like we're in this complete fog of uncertainty that started, within the last month or so. And I think it's going to be hard to make sort of long-term assessments of those risk-reward trade-offs that need to be made until things settle down a little bit longer. At least the 90 days that Trump is talking about, but it may be longer than that.
No, definitely, definitely. So there's a question again from Langa about whether this tariff moment doesn't offer us an opportunity to reindustrialize while everyone is looking inwards. And just to add to that question, whether the Just Energy Transition project, where do we fall when it comes to just energy transition with the US making it clear its position on this green facade and route to green pathway and sustainable pathway? Where does that leave South Africa as the poster child for the Just Energy Transition project? Irshaad?
So I mean, just briefly on Azwi's question about is this an opportunity to reindustrialize? It will certainly present opportunities, and I think I've touched on some of those areas that we're beginning to see emerge. And over this period, I think we'll continue to see opportunities that will emerge in this. And I think it's about spotting them and working consistently at them. And I think there's no replacement, none of the theory and talk. There's no replacement for rolling up your sleeves and getting into the detail. And I think, it's been my one experience is that we get very enthused by the idea in South Africa, but often don't back it up with some of the hard numbers and work that needs to go into it. So I think that would be my call out, my call to action to everyone is let.
Is it me or Irshaad is frozen? Oh, you were frozen for a bit. Prof. Alence, is Irshaad frozen on your side?
Yeah.
Okay. Irshaad, can you hear us?
I can. Sorry, Zoom decided to cut off for a second there.
Okay, go ahead,
Can you hear
please.
me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. What I'll do is I'm just going to turn my camera off if it's okay, just to save a little bit of bandwidth. So yeah, look, what I was saying is there is an energy transition that's happening, and the economics are supporting that. So what they often refer to as the levelized cost of energy, i.e., the cost to produce a kilowatt of energy from different sources. For a long time, coal was indeed the cheapest, but solar and wind and other renewable energy sources have become a lot cheaper. And even when one factors in the cost of storage, which is often one of the big criticisms of whether or not you can increase renewable energy on a grid, is there's this intermittency problem or this dispatchability problem that you have. But even if one brings in the cost of batteries and battery tech is improving all the time, it's incentivizing. And I think that the legislative changes that we've had in South Africa over the last 18 months have really supported increased investment in renewable energy, not just by the public sector, but by private sector players as well. So, what they often refer to as the corporate and industrial sector, CNI, is investing massively in renewable energy, not because it's nice to do from a green perspective, but actually it's just a cheaper source of energy. And so this is happening around the world. The United States has different attributes to what South Africa has. I mean, we do not have any oil of any significant kind in South Africa. Yes, we've got legacy technologies like gas to liquid and coal to liquid, but essentially we've lost a lot of the refining capacity. So we are importing a lot of crude oil in South Africa. Actually, we are genuinely incentivized to continue to invest in renewable energy sources. We don't have natural gas here, and there's an impending gas cliff, which I know has been the subject of other Wits conversations that's happened. But what that means in South Africa, we're incentivized to diversify our energy sources, both from an economic and other perspective. It does raise, and you specifically framed it as the just energy transition. And what the just part means is that as we diversify our energy sources, where do the jobs go? Because the jobs are concentrated in the coal value chain at the moment. There are about 150,000 direct jobs in Mpumalanga from coal. And if you extrapolate that to all of the induced services and other jobs, we're talking about 3 million livelihoods in that value chain. And one of the things that I think we've struggled with in the just transition is what are the other industries that can readily absorb that labor, and a lot of work is going into that. That will remain our challenge and something we're going to need to navigate, notwithstanding where Trump is going and where the US decides to go with its energy policy. Again, because we're dealing with just different endowments of resources, from fuel to natural gas. So I think that the just energy transition will remain a big feature of our politics and of our political economy, whether or not sustainability and green endeavors, goes through a little bit of malaise, which it does seem to have gone through in the US, and even actually in the EU, where the EU has largely been the champion of green and climate friendly policy. We're now starting to see some pushback against the EU Green Deal that was announced back in 2019, which has included sort of a slowdown in even the targets around introducing battery electric vehicles onto the roads. We've seen those extended, beyond the original time periods.
Thank you very much for that. And that actually got me thinking about, and you don't have to respond to this, but just as you were speaking about the just part of the just energy transition and what that means for different countries in the African continent. In the case of South Africa, when it comes to electricity or energy dynamics, the problem is more about reliability. But for other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, access remains a problem. And so the justice is not necessarily about jobs, but particularly about access and affordability. So it's quite interesting when you read literature on the just energy transition on Africa. We are all lumped in the same basket as if we have the same types and nature of problems. Professor Alence, reflections on the argument of looking inwards?
Sorry, could you repeat I was thinking green transition. What was the argument about looking inwards?
So it was Azri's point on, okay, I think Irshaad spoke to that in terms of does the tariff moment not offer us the opportunity to re-industrialize while everyone is looking inward? And of course, the conversation on the Just Energy Transition project.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, on both points, I think I would pretty much just reiterate what Irshaad has said. I think he summarized it well and put it well. And that the just transition and it's really something that's in South Africa's own interest, whether or not the US is willing to subsidize it. And I think there's even a lot of people in the US who realize that the government is making a mistake. I mean, there are some states in the United States that are actually proceeding with renewables against the policy, well, at least in not following the policy of the national government, not because they want to, defy the national government, but they just see it's in their own interest to do these things. And it's actually, it makes you think a little bit about making America great again. That you're trying to bring back the manufacturing jobs of the 40s and the 50s when you've got all these new jobs that are staring you in the face. and you're too busy looking to the past to really see that, where the new opportunities are coming. So it's not just Africa that faces these these dilemmas. Of course, whenever you have a sort of shock to the way you've been doing things, it inspires you to maybe question some things that you took for granted beforehand, and hopefully that will happen throughout the world.
Just a comment in the chat, just reflecting on South Africa-US relations and encouraging South Africa to simply focus on building internal strength, deepening regional ties, and ensuring that South Africa is not at the mercy of global powers that have never had its best interest at heart. Okay, as we come to a close on this important conversation, perhaps I'd give you both a minute or two to reflect on this theme before I call on Professor T.K. Poe to give a vote of thanks. Prof. Alence, you first, and then Irshaad.
All right. I feel like I almost just made my concluding remarks. I guess I would just go back to the beginning of what I said and emphasize that we're in a period of really unusual risk bordering on chaos in terms of how the international trading system has been thrown into a loop. We've already been through two distinct sort of tariff schedules for the world. We had the original cardboard sheet from the White House. Then we had the 10% tariffs, which somebody worked out actually, because there was an increase on the China tariffs on a trade-weighted basis, was actually heavier barriers than the first version, even though people see it as being kind of a reduction. So I would just urge people to really look out, rethink some of these issues of risk and opportunity in the world economy, but also realize that over the next few months a lot is going to change, and hopefully things will be a bit clearer after that. We won't go back to where we were before, but I think we'll probably go back to something that looks a lot different from what was on the news this morning, which may have changed while we've been talking. So
I see the shade. Thank you, Prof. Irshaad?
Yeah, so we are, look, I'd echo that we are in possibly the most interesting period of geopolitics that we've been in for the last 30 years, mostly. And we've been through this period of rapid globalization on a level that we haven't seen before. And while globalization and global integration has been championed and supported and celebrated by many, it's not without its challenges and its problems. And I think we're seeing the implications of that. I think what we're seeing in respect of global trade and at least a consternation and a rethink as to the extent to which we ought to be allowing, if that's the right word, different countries to export as much as they do to the United States and to others. We're also seeing similar concerns about immigration and the movement of people across borders, and I do think that this is all part of the very same sort of sets of themes. The world has collided in such a fantastic way over the last, call it 30 years, for all sorts of reasons, and that collision of the world has required a lot of kind of adjustment, and now we're seeing that backlash against that in the United States. Where this all ends up, I think, again, to my earlier point, we're in the process of sort of developing our first takes on all of this, and so much more will shake out, certainly over these 90 days, but I think even more so over the next couple of years to come. I think a lot will depend on how this impacts the real economy. So when we start to see inflation changing in some shape or form, I think that would be very, very interesting. As some of the movements in financial markets start to filter into the real economy, I think that's going to be interesting. Rod had mentioned that treasuries are at their most expensive levels, and for practically the last 20 years. So most of us in this room or on this call haven't lived in a world where we have 5%, 10-year treasuries and the implications that that means. We haven't lived in a world of stagflation, which was last really seen during the 1970s. We haven't seen those worlds, certainly not in our generation. And so how we navigate that and what assumptions we've made about the global economy and what we put to rest is going to be really, really interesting. So I suspect this is the first of many conversations we will have like this, and how it evolves. The part of me that tries to stay philosophical about these things is interested in seeing how that unfolds. The part of me that's developmental and concerned about where Africa ends up is worried that what often happens in these big global fights. There's that old adage that as elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled, and I am concerned about that. And we I think all of what we've raised and it's been raised in the comments, which have been very, very insightful, leads us to think we need to avoid being the grass and trying to find ways of surviving through this. So, no, thank you so much for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Prof. Alence and Irshaad, for your very insightful thoughts on the subject matter. Thank you to the audience. And as I mentioned, this is the first of many to come. So thank you for that. I will now hand over to Prof. Poi to give a vote of thanks.
Good evening, Ekemini, and to Irshaad and to Professor Alence. It's my role to try pretend to be smart after the smart people have spoken. And the smartest thing one could say is just to give a big thank you to Dr. Eyita-Okon, to Irshaad Kathrada, and to Professor Alence for really giving us, I think, valuable insights into, I think Irshaad kind of put it correctly. I call it, my thesis is we're now in a place I call political creative destruction. If people remember the economics, my favorite economist is Schumpeter. And Schumpeter, without going into a long lecture, because that's what our job is about, Schumpeter speaks, the quick one is we moved from CDs to iPods, and from iPods now we live in the cloud. And what we've not probably made, and I think Prof. Alence and Kathrada sort of touched on it, is we've not really made the calculation that we've so focused on technology that we've forgotten that even political systems are also things that do need to go through a process of political creative destruction. And some of the readings one has been doing, I found it a bit amazing, and I'm reminded of Samir Amin. He called it delinking. And it was already in the 1980s, this idea was floated upon that, listen, for Africa to really get its, and again, delinking is not to say we are decoupling, we're simply getting ourselves away from the world. And I think that's it's an incorrect way of reading it, but it's a way of saying, how do you prepare yourself internally and as a continent for the uncertainty that is to come? I'm reading in the comments, or one of the irritations I think most South Africans and also Africans generally might have is, of this morning, we're still fighting about VAT, whether it's 0.5 is coming or whether it's not coming from our political elites. Yet, what Professor Alence talked about, the impact of what Trump represents to the wider global world and what it's going to represent, as Irshaad talked about, when it hits your bread and butter, is not even a conversation which people are being told about. And that's why I enjoyed today's conversation. It was really about the bread and butter, explaining tough concepts to an audience who say, listen, we need to get our policy house in order. But much like I think Irshaad, I'm also a bit positive, because it should also tell us that the beauty of political creative destruction, as I call it, is it calls for an answer. And the answer cannot always be that we're always at the back foot of concepts and ideas. And it also calls for a heavy internal reform. And I think that's the exciting thing for me. But I think the smart people have spoken, and the smart people have moderated. For mine was just to thank everybody for joining us, to thank Mane Bukanyo for putting up with us at such short notice. And as Ekemini said, we are looking to be thought leaders in these spaces. So Professor Alence, please, this is the first of many invites. Irshaad, you owe me many invites, so we're going to be having you again. But from the school, thank you so much for everyone, and please look out for other communication and events we're going to be having. We're looking also to invite former ministers who work in trade, just to be able to give us some insight in terms of, listen, how do we better prepare for this? And most importantly, let's not treat this as a short-term phase, but let's start having conversation that says, where do we want to be in the next 10 to 30 years? Because I think that has been the problem, and let's prepare ourselves for it. So, Ekemini, thank you again so much for hosting this. and Mane. And so everybody, please do have a good evening. I was going to say, depending on what your VAT status is, please do enjoy the rest of what's left of the month.
Thank you, TK.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Prof.